Hi, my name is Alyssa Ware, and you should vote for me. Just kidding, but a lot of us have heard that and have been persuaded one way or the other, all using social media. The media is a huge part in what we discuss in life. It's how we get our information, and it's how we communicate to others what we did that day or the pictures of a vacation we took 2 years ago. The media is the path that brings our minds to conclusions, whether it's through words or through pictures. It prevents us from needing to use our imagination based on what happened or what it looks like, because it's all right there in our laptop, phones, and television. The media tells us what to think and even how to view a scenario, but can be different depending on the media setter's stance. Usually the media setters have completely different extremes due to their stances on criminal actions or political actions, but when society is given one side of the story, that's all they can believe because that's all that was given to them. McCombs and Shaw both believed that media had control over the brains of the world. I know that's a little extreme, but you still have the ability to disagree with certain media posts that you don't like, but you're still influenced by what they said or how they said it. It also focuses on what should be important, such as the news on TV. A lot of the time they focus on things that should be viewed as important, like crime, political stances, or the weather. And we can weed out our personal preference of what is or isn't, but when it comes to people who have an influence on a certain type of group, like a band or a singer, they may find that crime is more important than the weather, and any devoted fan or even someone who looks to them for advice and watches them for their Facebook feed will most likely read more about crime and know more than the weather, because that's what they chose and that's who they chose as their media setter. Of course, this isn't as likely, but it also is how we get our information, and to continue to spread it by saying, oh, did you hear so-and-so say this? And it continues to snowball down the hill and continue to transfer from mouth to television to computer and Facebook and Instagram, and it continues over and over again. The media is also great at telling people what to think about. Maybe not in how to view it, but they put the image in our mind. Although a lot of it is denied by media to ensure the society's freedoms, but it then plays a role by letting us think we made the choice to think about it. But the agenda setters had already placed it there in order for you to think about it. The agenda setting hypothesis by McCombs and Shaw reinforced this by stating that the mass media has the ability to transfer the salience of issues on their news agenda to the public's agenda. And after the study, it brought the anticipated results of the influence of the media to the minds of the voters. It became clear that the motive for social media and the increase in technology could possibly be due to the lack of individual thought. Not saying that all original thought is taken away, but the immediate response and the thought that was taken from the news feed or article is what we were given, and that's what we thought about. We weren't thinking, oh, well, the weather is obviously 40 degrees. No, you watched it on the Weather Channel, and that's how we get it. Otherwise, we wouldn't give it a second thought. Even if we read news articles about a crime that was committed, the media setter who believes that the criminal was right may justify the criminal and convince the audience that they're right. But they may also leave out the fact that the criminal had a background that had to do with insanity, and that's why they killed the person. the audience would then have more of the one side that was given to them instead of the truth. And that's where freedom is taken away. It's where press and freedom of speech have so much control that we rely on it so heavily. There's so many people who rely on Facebook for all of their news, or they rely on the Weather Channel, or they rely on things that don't give us the full truth. As we know, the media contradicts a lot of what society believes and says, especially when it comes to our values. This can change over the years due to who the biggest hit is or what they said, and then they're just placed as the agenda setter. Say, if enough people liked a celebrity, maybe even like the girl on Dr. Phil, who all she said was "Catch Me Outside," and it became this big hit. But if any of them had gone around and just said that, oh, well, it's completely normal to shove pie in a random person's face, then the next day, Facebook feeds and Instagram would be full of videos of people doing it. Just like dabbing or flipping water bottles. Many may state that it's stupid and refuse to participate, but those who love the celebrity or think it's so cool and want to connect with them are more likely to follow what they say and to do what they do, which becomes a problem when we see that the media's agenda is so close to identical to the public's agenda. It brings in that sense of control of society's thoughts and what was brought into their mind. Things have also changed over years. If you look at trends and fads that both girls and boys had, for a couple years, girls had puffy hair, and one year it all changed to curled or straightened or pigtails. It was all based on what celebrities were doing or what everyone in school thought was cool. But it's also what is said to be normal. What everyone is doing is normal, and whether or not you follow it, you could either be an outcast or you could be accepted. But many of the trends are made because celebrities start them, or they say, hey, do it with me, it's so cool. Some can be good, but others can be hurtful to the rest. I know for years there were different conflicts between a model and not having any bigger models in the model society, and it became so hurtful for others that nowadays it's coming out and it's saying this is what we need to do and this is the new trend. Media is known nationwide and is used on a daily basis by most countries that have access to it. In doing so, it makes it so easy for the media to also change the beliefs in using stories or different sides of a stories. Of course, if we look at the countries on the slide, even though they are similar in use, they are different in what media is talking about. Even the average amount is high, but you can also get countries like Qatar that have a lower rate in use, and some countries don't have the luxury of electronics or don't need to have that extra communication for us to know what's going on or to know what is happening in the world. But they have to have trends and things that are cool or popular still. It just may not be used through the social media. When it comes to things like trends and memes and news stories, they can be different from country to country. So something in America could be so cool, but the UK may be doing something completely different. They also have different morals and different media setters, so different people in different places. But when you go from city to country, things will be similar since it would generically be the same thing, but it could also show a different side. A lot of the influence can come from politics too. When we're in election year, just like last year, a bunch of posters were put up and slogans, and people with pins were there to just convince the audience to vote for that certain president or told us why they were there. Most want to show one story and entail that the president will be fantastic and what they'll do. But if the media setter doesn't like that president, then there may be more on what is bad about the president than good. Just like when Trump was nominated and there were multiple celebrities who also claimed that they would leave the country and never come back because it was going to be so terrible. And many agreed and connected with their feelings, but the agenda setter on the opposite stance had different feelings. So in this case, we get both sides, but not everyone is going to be able to see both sides because they're both split. No one talks about the other side and their side. It's very dependent on how the media setter feels and views things because they are the ones in power. Although we may feel as though we're in power of what we think and what we look at, and we are, because we choose who we want on our Facebook feed and we choose which people to follow and to listen to, but it's not only that, then it makes it so difficult. While I'm not here to convince you of this stance on social media, I did get you to think about it. I'm going to hand off the rest of the slides to my wonderful partner, Jason Brown, now.
Hey everyone, I'm going to be taking over the remainder of Unit 30, starting with framing. Framing is defined as the selection of a restricted number of thematically related attributes for inclusion on the media agenda when a particular object or issue is discussed. Starting with James Tankard, one of the leading writers on mass communication theory, views a media frame as the central organizing idea for news content that supplies a context and suggests what the issue is through the use of 1. Selection, 2. Emphasis, 3. Exclusion, and 4. Elaboration. Through the selection of these 4 things, the media really holds the power to choose what issues, events, or candidates are publicly viewed as most important because they have the ability to transfer the salience to whichever subjects they want. So basically, the media has the power to frame stories the way they choose, highlighting certain aspects of the story they find to be most important. We might not get the entire picture or multiple angles of a story, just the most juicy or deemed most interesting based on the media provider. When I think about framing, I think about the idea of there being multiple sides to every story. To the millions of viewers at home, we see a story the one way it gets framed. Just a funny example of framing, I went to Israel last summer, and before I went, there was a shooting in Tel Aviv. All over the news in Chicago, I was hearing about how dangerous Tel Aviv was and the crime and all the crime that's taking place there, and how now is a really bad time to travel to Israel. Well, 2 weeks later, I was in Tel Aviv, and it was beautiful, and I could not have felt safer. But while I was there was a shooting that occurred in Chicago. The people of Tel Aviv had the same reaction to the shooting in Chicago that we had about Tel Aviv. It all boiled down to framing. Because the media, both in Tel Aviv and in Chicago, made it seem like these cities had become so dangerous, people were almost fearful in going. The media, 1, selected to only talk about the crime that was taking place. 2, emphasized the dangers of going to visit. 3, they excluded to address all the amazing parts in the city and all the incredible things the city had to offer. And 4, they chose not to elaborate on the problem as a whole, solely focusing on the one crime that occurred and blowing it up until it defined that city. I just found this so fascinating, and it really gave me a perspective I hadn't had before. The last thing I want to leave you with framing is that framing isn't an option. As humans, we inevitably frame stories, telling the stories the way we view them to have happened. You or I could be watching the same event take place, and our stories from the event could be completely different. This all comes down to the way we frame them. Continuing on with the concept that media inevitably frames stories to fit their viewers, we have broke it down a little further. Take the major media outlets, for example. The New York Times, Associated Press, MSNBC, Newsweek, Time, ABC, Fox, CNN, NBC, CBS. They all have a slightly to majorly different audience demographic. Being competing networks and the top media outlets in the world, they all typically cover all of the same major headline news stories, but the way they frame them and the content they choose to select, emphasize, exclude, and elaborate on can be very different. I know you may all be sick of talking about Donald Trump, but he's the perfect example of showing how different media outlets have very different agendas. Any story, big or small, that involves Donald Trump, the media picks up. Take CNN. You will probably never hear them say anything positive about the guy. Anything he does is basically horrible and negative. In any situation, they choose to highlight all the bad that came out of the situation involving Trump. Switch the channel to Fox, and you'll get an entirely opposite view of the same exact story. They discuss at length about all the strides President Trump is making and the amount of progress he has achieved since he was sworn into office. I know my parents sometimes will jump around to various news channels to hear multiple perspectives on the same issues, but it is clear that every media outlet has its own media agenda and a goal to persuade its viewers to see an issue the way they want them to. Media truly holds a lot of power and has the ability to influence and touch the lives of millions of people. While being in the media can be detrimental exposure if portrayed negatively, it is also insanely advantageous if portrayed in a positive light. Also, media is an unbelievable outlet to get your voice and other people's voices heard. Media has the ability to bring salience and attention to issues of all kinds. That's where interest aggregations come into play. These are clusters of people who demand center stage for their one overriding concern. They are pressure groups. Think protests such as Black Lives Matter, gay rights movement, anti-abortion, or pro-life. These groups are all trying to gain media attention in order to get their voices and their messages heard to a broader audience. If the media deems it important, then the public will start deeming it as important. So much of the progress these groups have made has been from rallies that have gotten picked up from media groups and their constant demands for being heard. Transitioning into another way media could use their powerful platform, Clifford Christians, a former director of the Institute of Communications Research at the University of Illinois, introduces the idea of communitarian ethics, which in our text book is defined as a moral responsibility to promote community, mutuality, and in persons in relation who live simultaneously for others and for themselves. So, Christian feels strongly that the media should be using their platform for good, and he sees selfish practices to stir up drama, conversation, and kind of to spark problems are evil. He believes that discovering truth is possible if willing to examine the nature of our humanity. He stands by the concept of agape love, and that journalists have the responsibility to promote the sacredness of life by representing human dignity, truth-telling, and doing no harm to innocence. It is a really interesting concept. Christians basically argues that the media shouldn't be out there to cause trouble, but rather to tell people's stories and to make a positive impact on people's lives. He, in a way, wants media to be viewed as a superhero, with its superpower being broadcasting all that is good in the world and kind of like shifting the focus on promoting community and human rights. Ultimately, he wants to use the media's power to champion the goal of social justice. Christians makes me ponder the goal of the media nowadays. He argues and rejects the reports on absolute right for freedom of expression. He thinks what's broadcasted and said on the media should be in favor of personhood and community. So I ask, who is the press a voice for? Those who can't speak for themselves, the homeless, ethnic minorities, the wealthy, the immigrants? It definitely makes me think about the current goals of the media and whether or not they are taking the First Amendment too far when it comes to broadcasting their thoughts from such a high platform across the globe. He states that if the media changes their agenda to highlight these attributes about focusing on encompassing community, and then they are truly fulfilling their communitarian responsibility. I chose to end with this kind of slide because I thought it posed kind of just interesting questions about, like, when the media is now kind of changing to more of an online setting versus print, just kind of talking about the stuff that the media actually kind of loses power a little bit. I don't know, I found it really interesting, and so I just kind of thought it would be fun to end with this. So basically, University of Illinois researchers Scott Althus and David Tewksbury predicted that traditional print would be more effective than new electronic media in setting a reader's agenda, which I found really, really interesting, because typically we kind of are thinking that, like, the print is becoming more and more outdated, but it seems like the kind of their view that the print is actually more effective in setting a reader's agenda, which I didn't really consider until reading this. So, basically, people reading newspapers are clearly guided by the editors of the paper on what the most important stories are. Going back to the idea of framing, like we talked about earlier, editors who work in print are able to highlight in their minds the most important articles by kind of how they position them. They use bigger headline fonts. They use, they really utilize the front page articles and pictures. They kind of are able to make these big long stories. And like we, as the audience, view these articles and stories as high importance compared to the smaller articles written in the paper that the editor kind of chooses not to highlight as much. So they're kind of like in the corner, or where they're positioned. They're not as, your eyes aren't drawn to those articles. But with electronic news, the audience has greater control, being able to click and choose the stories that they read, that they want to read based on their personal interests. Not only this, but the online news pages provide users with way more content. Categories and choices for the audience, giving them the opportunity to kind of personalize what they're exposing themselves to. So we're on online news pages, you're kind of able to click where you want. You read, let's just say you read a bunch of headlines and you get to choose what direction you want to go to. And you kind of start to personalize it rather than your eyes going straight to kind of what the media wants you to focus on. Kind of those big stories, you kind of get to choose, oh, there's an article about sports. Okay, that's where I want to go to. Rather than if you just have a list of a bunch of different articles you could choose to and click of a bunch of links, you kind of choose to what you're interested in rather than what kind of is going on in the world, or what kind of as a whole is kind of the big story at the time. It's an interesting case that Althus and Tewksbury make. And as technology advances and online options become more self-directed, does the media agenda's effect on what people read and see decrease? I just thought that was kind of an interesting question to leave you all. Do you find kind of that the more that technology advances, does the media's agenda and the effect that they have on their audience and kind of guiding them on what they should be looking at, what they should be seeing, does that decrease? And that is a wrap from Jason and Alyssa. Hope you enjoyed the presentation.